The member from Kenora-Rainy River.
Thank you, Speaker. I rise today to speak on Bill 19, an amendment to the Residential Tenancies Act, especially with regard to capping annual rent increases from 1 to 2.5%. In preparing for my discussion today, I spent a lot of time going over the remarks of my colleague, MPP for Welland's remarks on this subject, and I believe she raised a number of important points about this bill and the affordable housing crisis that is facing our province. But rather than repeat the member for Welland's remarks, I will try to build on them, and I'll try to bring a northern perspective to the table, because the challenges that we face in the north with regard to affordable housing are at times very similar, but at other times very different than those being faced by members in southern Ontario. And I dare say that in my region, a rent increase cap might be a little less effective than proposing a cap on utility bill increases, which is something that I'll touch on a little later in my speech. But before I go too far, I do want to draw a distinction, which I think that my party does quite eloquently, between the rhetoric that's been used in this debate. So much of the rhetoric in this debate has been focusing on the term landlord. Now, I want to be quite clear that there are some exceptionally good landlords out there. Generally, these landlords aren't looking to make a huge profit or living off of their properties, but instead, in situations where maybe their piece of property is more than one building, which is actually quite common in my region, where they've either moved out of town and they were unable to sell their property, or various other circumstances that have led them to focus on more so paying their expenses rather than profiting on the backs of others. So I do think that my party does a pretty good job of making this distinction in its proposal to require those who rent out 6 or more units to be a licensed landlord in the province. I think it draws a fairly clear distinction between those who may, for one reason or another, own a couple of properties and those who are actually in the business to make a profit. I'd also like to say that there are many good landlords out there who do profit from their investments, but do so in a way that's respectful of their tenant and their tenant's needs. In fact, there are many instances where landlords have had their property destroyed by bad tenants and have been forced to incur costs that are well above anything that they could ever possibly recover from the tenant to repair or replace the unit. So I just wanted to make that distinction. There are good landlords and there are bad landlords, just as there are good tenants and bad tenants. And ideally, the Residential Tenancies Act would protect both sides in a fair and respectful manner. But with that in mind, I'd like to look at some of the concerns I have with this bill and the Residential Tenancies Act in general. One of my greatest concerns is the lack of consistency, both for tenants in general and those seeking affordable housing. When an individual is looking for a house or an apartment to rent, they have to look at 2 completely different models. Those that are all-inclusive versus those where utilities and rent are actually separate. I think it's fair to say for many people who may be starting out, and it may be true for all people, that determining this difference in value can be quite difficult. It's difficult that those who are looking for a place to rent where utilities are not included, for them to really determine, based on the tenant's former bill, whether their costs will be in line with that or not. Some people look at the former tenant's bill and say, well, I'm frugal. I don't use this or that. I don't use a lot of electricity. I'm sure I can keep my costs down. I may be more accustomed to living in a cooler climate. But then they can be hit with an exceptionally high bill shortly thereafter. And the same could be said for landlords who rent their premises as an all-inclusive sort of deal. I know of a situation, and actually it's a little comical. It was with my husband before we met, and he was renting a unit. What happened was one day his landlord approached him, and she was concerned about the high consumption of electricity that he was using in the apartment. And this was after she had already gone to Ontario Hydro 1, and asked what could possibly cause this spike of hydro. She was concerned that he had a grow-up going on because the spike had been so high. Yeah. Turns out it was a coffee maker, which you would not think that a coffee maker would cause that kind of a spike, but my husband drinks a lot of coffee, so he had it plugged in most of the time. So what she ended up doing in that situation to kind of minimize the cost that she was spending was she bought a very expensive, energy-efficient coffee maker to try to bring those costs down. So, of course, with the cost of hydro soaring so much in recent years, I'm sure more and more landlords are moving away from this all-inclusive model because it simply poses too much risk and it's just too expensive, especially where I live. You know, it's very much the case. In my region, I'm not so convinced that this proposed amendment is going to make that big of a difference. With the downturn in the forest industry, many communities in my region have a substantial number of vacancies, and there are a number of opportunities for individuals to rent places for near cost. Simply because the real estate market is tanked, there are many people who need to leave the community to find a job elsewhere, but they're unable to sell their house, so they're forced to rent it. And it's very hard to sell a house, as I said, when the industry has taken a hit, people aren't buying houses, and we're seeing houses that go for over $100,000, $150,000, selling for as little as $20,000 to $25,000. And so it's difficult for people who are renting multiple complexes or complexes with multiple units to make a profit and to sell those. So this situation is really quite different from what's happening in Toronto right now, where you have very profitable hotels that are being shut down in order that condos can be built. Utilities, on the other hand, are a real killer in our region. The price of electricity has gone through the roof, and so has the price of fuels such as home heating, oil, and also electricity. That too is another thing that people don't necessarily think about when they are looking to rent a place. I know I have an experience where I rented a very small place in rural northwestern Ontario, outside of any kind of formal municipality. It was a small 800 square foot place, and my monthly bills were in the range of $500 to $700 just to heat the building, and that was not including any electricity or anything like that. So I would like to touch a little bit on affordable housing, as my colleague from Welland very aptly and skillfully discussed the other day. And the truth is that many of the affordable housing units that we have built in this province, at least where I live, were built 30 to 40 years ago, and they were built quickly and they were built cheaply. So in many cases, they're insulated poorly, they're poorly ventilated, and some of these units are subsidized, have the electricity and the heat included, and others do not. So here we have a situation. I know when I was a constituency assistant before I ran in the legislature, I had a couple people from Red Lake call down, and they were very concerned because they didn't have a lot of money. And so their subsidized rent was about $85 a month. But their hydro bills, when they came in, were in the neighborhood of $700 to $800. So how does that make sense? And when I talked to the Area District Services Board, who provides these subsidized housing units, they said that unfortunately they aren't able to provide it for everybody. And for those folks in those units that they do provide everything included, that sometimes they're subsidizing in the neighborhood of $3,000 a month just for electricity. So the point that I'm trying to make is that this bill does go a ways towards capping some of the profits that landlords can make, but it does very little for those who can afford to rent the least, whose utilities are already spiraling out of control. And I'd like to see this bill do more to address that.
Thank you.